The Pink House Poltergeist. The 100-year-old Pink Mansion sits prominently on Maple Street in River Falls, Wisconsin. The box-shaped dwelling rises to nearly 3 stories, with the roof slanting dramatically upward and a cupola resting like a wooden crown on the peak. An early Wisconsin lieutenant governor, Colonel Charles Parker, built the home for his family. Through the decades, the house has undergone a number of renovations and uses: apartments, duplex, and single-family dwelling. In 1970, Tim and Alice Early bought the house, planning to rent out the second floor and then remodel the downstairs section for themselves. The house had been sectioned into several apartments and sleeping rooms by previous owners. Shortly after the Early family, which included a young daughter Jessica, moved into the house, a series of odd events led them to believe that there were another occupant in the house, when they could not see. The presence was friendly enough, according to Tim. Doors opened for no apparent reason. Lights would suddenly switch on. Their daughter's rubber ball would inexplicably roll across the floor, or to a stereo tape player would increase in volume. It was just like someone was with us, Tim emphasizes. You know how someone can sneak up on you, and although you don't hear them or see them, you know that someone is there? Well, it was that kind of an experience. Only 2 years old, Jessica was ever frightened by the antics of their unseen tenant. On at least one occasion, the child came running from her bedroom, very frightened. She had been playing quietly with her toys, but something scared her. A child's imagination? Perhaps. Neither parent ever discussed a ghost in the child's presence. A friend of the Earlys, a college student, had rented the room several years before. At that time, it was used as a sleeping room. He, too, had sensed a presence. The student often joked about his third roommate. The couple agreed that when they started remodeling the first floor in the early fall of 1970, the incidents increased. The 2 largest rooms on that floor were a living room and a dining room separated by French doors. Draperies had also been hung to cover the archway, since both areas had not been used as sleeping rooms by previous renters. We were remodeling what was going to be our living room, Tim recalls. We had finished the room. The evening we completed the work, I was sitting in the dining room with Jessica. Alice was in the kitchen. And then, at the same time, the light went off in the empty living room, and the French doors between the rooms opened. I called Alice, and she came out. At about the same time I called her, the screen door on the front porch opened and closed. It wasn't windy at all, so we just assumed that our friend left. The couple believed the ghost was leaving the house for a very specific reason. Alice thinks it was because they had remodeled the room and were going to make use of it. There was no room for another resident. Any old house has a varied and sometimes obscure history, making possible explanations for psychic phenomena difficult. But the Earlys tried to find the source of the mysterious happenings, and in 1972, they met a psychic from the southern Wisconsin who agreed to hold a seance in the house. Was the poltergeist still in the house? If so, who was it? The psychic found a negative presence in the house, along with a more friendly spirit the Earlys had encountered. Afraid to dwell on the negative spirit, the psychic instead described the man she could see, a man the Earlys believed could have been Charles Parker, the original owner. She saw the porch, which is no longer there, Alice recalls. A house now occupies the area between the long vanished porch at the end of the house and the street. She saw a rocker and described Parker sitting on the rocker with a cat in his lap. She said he was very attached to that cat. The woman psychic also remembers the events clearly. I couldn't understand why this gentleman was sitting looking out when there's a house there. I just couldn't understand why he was sitting in that chair. And after the seance was over, I asked them, the Earlys, about it. They said that's where the road used to be. But I didn't know that. There's definitely a spirit in that house. He's a very friendly one, too. I don't think he'd do anything negative. That was his house at one time. He had lived there. Usually when you get spirits that reside in a home, they're friendly, they're very happy in that house. And what was the negative presence, they asked. Neither the psychic nor the Earlys ever found out. Although they researched the history of the house, there was still some doubt that the friendly poltergeist was indeed that of Charles Parker. The experiences did prompt an interest in psychic phenomena, and whenever possible, they told friends and visitors about their ghost. On one occasion, an exchange student from England told the couple the rounded walls in the house were unusual. In England, their visitor said, such construction was designed to keep evil spirits out of the room. Although Tim and Alice Early no longer live in the mansion, they will never forget their life in the haunted home on Maple Street. The Lady in Brown. Can some people survive physical death and somehow remain behind, in an altered state, to watch over a home for which they had a strong emotional attachment in life? That question has perplexed ghost hunters for decades. Scores of tales detail nightly visitations to houses by the ghosts of former tenants. Brenda Wiedner knows all about such appearances. She lived for 5 years in a haunted house southwest of Durand. Brenda, her husband Robert, and the couple's 2-year-old son moved into a rented rural 2-story frame home in 1970. There was no indication the house was anything but what it appeared to be, a rather old structure in a grove of elm and oak trees on a country road. It was not unlike thousands of other homes throughout Wisconsin. Everything seemed normal that first year. Rob Wiedner drove each day to the factory where he worked the night shift. Miss Wiedner stayed home with young Derek. But the ideal of country life was shattered late one evening in the spring of 1971 as Brenda waited for her husband to return home. It was that night when she first heard the pounding in the walls, gently at first, almost too faint to detect. Then the sound grew in intensity. What was it like? The walls would vibrate and curtains would shake, Brenda remembers. I thought at first it was someone outside with a baseball bat. It happened first on one living room wall, and then on another wall, and then back and forth. It would go on for 5 or 10 minutes, just like someone was inside the wall trying to get out. When the hammering ceased, Brenda sat frozen on the couch, afraid to move and reluctant to search outside the cold, starless black of night. The sounds continued periodically over the next several years. The rappings would usually begin after 10 p.m. and continue for several minutes. Were there squirrels chasing across the roof? Small animals trapped in the walls, frantically searching for an escape route? Brenda didn't think so. The sounds were absent during the day and at other times of the night. Robert searched by the house and the grounds, and when he returned home that first night, but found nothing that could have produced those thumpings. And Robert never heard the sounds on that night or any night thereafter. Were the noises merely the product of an overly active imagination? Was their entire plausible answer? A few months after the pounding in the walls began, Brenda learned she was not the only person to have heard the strange noises. A local teenage girl had been employed by the Wiedners to watch over Derek when the couple went out on an evening, but the young woman became unavailable after only a short while. Brenda and her husband were perplexed. We couldn't figure out what happened, and I was quite upset by it, Brenda recalls. I asked her what we had done, and she said nothing. It's the house that upset her. She said that she couldn't stand the pounding inside the walls. It happened in the living room wall behind the stove and then would move across to the other wall. That's where I heard it too. Neither Brenda nor her husband had ever mentioned the pounding noises to the girl. Brenda also discovered that the pounding in the walls was not the only frightening experience the young girl had in the home. Every time she shut off the basement lights, they would go on again, and the basement door would open. She could shut off the lights and close the door and go back in there 5 minutes, and the lights would be on again and the door open. She just couldn't take it anymore. She didn't want to tell me, but every time I called, she would have excuses. I finally found out why. It was the house. The babysitter's chilling encounters and Brenda's earlier experiences proved to be just the first in a series of the strange encounters with the unknown. Young Derek provided the first hint to an identity for the unseen tenant. The boy's bedroom was adjacent to the living room and only a few feet from the small kitchen. Brenda was preparing lunch one afternoon when she heard her son's voice coming from behind the closed door of his room. The young mother stopped her activity, crossed the living room, and stood outside the bedroom. She heard only her son's muffled voice. The boy would speak a few words, stop, then continue. Brenda thought at the time the child was carrying on a conversation with someone, but only his voice was audible. For several minutes, Brenda had listened. At length, the boy emerged from the room in confused expression. "Mom," he said, "I just talked to an old lady in my room." Brenda glanced into the small bedroom and saw no one. She asked him if he were positive it was an old woman. He said yes, the child replied, vigorously nodding his head. He wasn't scared, Brenda says, just bewildered by the experience. She would have had dismissed the child's report, but for the eerie experience and her knowledge that Derek had never before made up imaginary people, as do many children. Brenda began to wonder if there was a connection between the mysterious old woman and the knockings. Other events began to take place that reinforced Brenda's belief that some unseen entity was at work in the house. On some occasion, she would hear moaning or groans whenever she worked in the kitchen area. It would come from behind, but no one was in the house. It was like someone was in pain, she said. What was causing the turmoil? Could there be a natural explanation, or did young Derek actually see someone or something in his bedroom? Brenda had never taken seriously the stories of haunted houses or ghosts, but she began to wonder if there wasn't some truth to those tales. Was she experiencing supernatural phenomenon? Determined to learn more about the house and its history, Brenda began questioning neighbors and the present owner of the house, the elderly son of the original owners. Gradually, she pieced together the story of Miss Gerda Bierman, the late wife of the house's builder. Her entire life had been spent in the house, and in it she died in the early 1950s. But what startled Brenda was two peculiar facts relating to the woman's last days on Earth. Gerda Bierman had died in the room now occupied by young Derek Weidner, and she reportedly had told the housekeeper that she would never leave that house. Was it possible that this woman had been Derek's mysterious visitor, and was she responsible for the other mischief in the house? A few months later, something happened that seemed to indicate that perhaps Gerda's vow was more than the idle ramblings of a dying woman. Brenda was sitting on the couch in the comfortably furnished living room, watching a television program, and waiting for her husband to arrive home. It was now shortly after midnight. She expected him within a few minutes. Suddenly, Brenda heard the kitchen door swing open and then close moments later. "Robert, is that you?" she called out. There was no answer. Surprised, she rose quickly and walked into the kitchen. It wasn't Robert. The nearly transparent image of a woman wearing a brown dress hovered near the outside door. The specter hung motionless in the air, its vacant eyes staring past the frightened young woman. Brenda gazed at the vision, noting that, although the body was perfectly outlined, a vaporous mist seemed to form an aura around the figure. Several inches of space separated the specter's feet from the kitchen floor. Suddenly the ghost began to move, floating slowly across the room. Within seconds it disappeared into the pantry. Brenda walked cautiously over and peered in. The tiny storage room was vacant. A basement door at the far end of the pantry was locked shut. An overhead light was off. The room was silent and dark. Brenda was dazed. It was the first time a physical presence had presented itself to her. As she turned to walk into the living room, her thoughts raced back to all she had learned of the late Gerda Bierman. Yeah, she realized the specter in the kitchen did fit the description of Mrs. Bierman. The dress was plain and old-fashioned. The face looked haggard and old, yet Brenda couldn't grasp the possibility of having just seen a ghost. She hadn't dreamed the entire episode, she decided, and returned to the kitchen for a glass of water to calm her frayed nerves. But what she beheld didn't help her at all. The pantry light was now on, the basement door was wide open, and the basement lights were ablaze. How? Why? She had just checked the pantry minutes before, and yet her eyes didn't lie. She gazed down the rough wooden basement steps, but saw and heard nothing. She switched off the lights and closed the basement door. Now she understood the babysitter's tale about the basement and its self-propelled lights. What hand had turned them on? What fingers had encircled the basement doorknob and pulled it softly open? Until the Weidner family moved out of the house, Brenda often found the basement door open and the downstairs lights switched on without reason. Did Gerda Bierman lead Brenda to the basement door for some purpose? Brenda searched the ancient earthen cellar several times without success. It was an old, musty, and rather forbidding, but it contained nothing out of the ordinary as far as Brenda could tell. Other puzzling accounts occurred, as Brenda recalls. I had a vase of flowers on the back kitchen counter that would move all the time. I'd put it back, but it would move from in front of the radio to beside it. It happened one time when Bob and my son were there. I asked Bob to please quit moving the vase, but he said he hadn't touched it. Now, I never saw it move, but it was moved. Perhaps Gerda preferred the vase beside the radio. The Weidner's dog, a German Shepherd, also sensed a ghostly presence in the house. Brenda said that on numerous occasions, the dog would crouch down on her stomach. She was petrified. I knew then that she, Gerda, was around. That dog was absolutely frightened of something. One particular episode involving the animal stands out in Brenda's mind. One day, while she was working in another part of the house, a crash resounded from the kitchen. The dog sprang to its feet and followed Brenda to the source of the disturbance. But Brenda could find nothing broken or out of place. I could never explain it. I checked everything, but there was nothing wrong. Just that loud crash. My dog heard it, and so did Brenda. Shortly before the Weidners moved from the house in early 1976, Brenda had her final and in many ways most chilling encounter with the ghost of Gerda Bierman. The late woman's son had recently built a new porch onto the rear of the house. Brenda recalls what happened a few days after the porch was completed. This was in the winter, about February. I was in the kitchen fixing a meal. My dog was with me, and Derek was taking a nap. There was a door which led to the porch from the kitchen, which we always kept closed. Then I heard a woman's voice on the porch. Then I knew it was empty. I heard her say, "Look what my son has done to the house. He built this porch." My dog's ears went up and its fur stood on end, and she started to growl. The voice outside started talking in what sounded like German. She started rambling and mumbling. I opened the door, but the voice stopped. My dog ran out and sniffed at the corners, on the steps, every place. Her fur was up. She knew someone had been out there, and I checked the doors and windows, and they were all locked from the inside. Snow was on the ground, and there were no footprints or the tire tracks. But there had been that voice. I heard it with my own ears. That's when I knew for sure it was Gerda Biermann. She was German, and I understand she often spoke the language. And the voice had been talking about what her son had done to the house. And that was the last I ever heard from her. The Biermann house still exists, holding any wandering ghost within its weathered walls. No one else seems to have had the same experience Brenda witnessed during her 5 years in the house, and she was the sole target for most of the events. Her husband found the basement lights on and his door open on one occasion, but dismissed that episode as coincidence. Derek was too young to remember how his puzzling conversation that afternoon in his bedroom. The babysitter felt there was something terrifying enough in that house to refuse to work there, and the large family dog whimpered and grew frightened on the occasion when Brenda saw or felt Gerda Biermann's ghost in the house. Was it all imagination? There are far more questions than answers to this puzzle. Brenda Weidner is visibly shaken to this day when she recounts the events of her life in the Biermann house. One thing is certain. She will never forget that old farmhouse on a country road southwest of Durand. It isn't unlike thousands of other houses with this one. Macabre exception. It has a ghost.